All right. So we left off talking about Greek Revival architecture and how this applied, especially in early America, in the early 1800s into the mid 1800s, and how um, Greek architecture and sort of reviving it was a way for early Americans to express their connection to the ancient democracy, of Athens, um, and kind of carry this beyond. It was a similar theme to the early, very early American architecture that was based a little more on Roman and Palladian connections. But this shifted, and this Greek revival architecture became very, very popular. A lot of cities, as the country grew west into what we now call the Midwest, it was kind of the frontier west back in the early 1800s. But a lot of city names got named after Greek cities and Roman cities. Cicero, Illinois Cicero was a famous Roman senator during, somebody's got their mic on. They could turn that off. Cicero, was a famous Roman senator during the Republic. And place like Minneapolis, Apollos, or Opolis is, the name for city in Greek. So, Indianapolis is another example. So we see a lot of examples like that, as well as the architecture itself. And we started talking about William Strickland and his Second Bank of the U.S. in Philadelphia. And in 1845, he won the commission to design the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville. Here it is, actually a fairly current view of it. And so he basically moved to Nashville, Tennessee to oversee the design and construction of this, and essentially finished out his career and life in Tennessee, which would have been a growing, this was a relatively new state. It was growing. He had this big commission, and I'm sure he was able to get other commissions based on this as well. And he really based the Capitol building here on a Greek temple, very similar to what he had done at the Second U.S. Bank. So here we see, pointer going, here we see on the front is a portico with a very distinctive Ionic order, very properly proportioned. It has the entablature and a pediment at the end of the gable. Now he doesn't put sculpture in here, again, like the Greeks might have done. And in fact, the portico is a little different here than what we would expect to see in a Greek temple, in that it's raised up. So that, there's the steps that lead up to it actually lead up to a base below here. And then the temple front is really raised up beyond that. So it becomes more of a porch, like an overhanging second floor porch than it does entry portico. But that all is a part of what it means to call something a revival. That it's ultimately not an accurate, complete, recreation of the original. It is based on that, and then it gets reinterpreted. So we're seeing that here. But one of the things that's really distinctive about the Tennessee Capitol is what we see up on top here. It doesn't have a dome, which we tend to think of for most Capitol buildings. We even saw that at the Massachusetts State House by Bulfinch. This has just a tall cupola on top. And the cupola is quite distinctive ties to Greek architecture. It's based on the Lyscrates monument in Athens that dates from 334 BCE. And here we see on the right is an image of it that would have been reproduced in books that Strickland would have had access to. So certainly would have been able to, essentially copy it or been inspired by it from these images. And on the left is an actual image of the monument as it appears in Greece. I took this when I was there about 11 years ago. And so it's more of a ruin, but you can see it's pretty much there. And I think, let me look and see here. This is the front. Let's go back to the previous image, and you can see it's a pretty faithful reproduction of that. It really shows the the top round, sits on a plinth here, but it shows the rotunda element to it. And, it was always a solid, this has some window in it, but it was always a solid wall. And then it has a little bit of a decorative doodad on top there. And if we go back and we look at it on top, originally was a little, what looks like maybe an eagle or something. And then, it was just a solid masonry monument. It wasn't a structure or didn't have anything inside of it per se. Strickland reinterprets that to have, a little bit of a window and light could come in to help illuminate the chamber, which we see here. This is the main chamber for their legislature or whatever. And you can see a little bit here is, some in the background are more Greek revival elements, the colonnades and plinths that sit on there. Here's a historic photo taken during the Civil War. Similar to what we saw, say, with the Richmond State House by Jefferson, it sits on top of a hill to be monumental. It really kind of appears as though it's a temple on a hilltop, the way the Athenians would have done on the Acropolis or something like that. And I like to show the historic view of that because there aren't tall buildings all around it. In the 1860s, it was sort of sitting all by itself. Now it's more surrounded by modern city, but you get the sense of what Strickland was thinking about as far as having this on here. So some other examples that aren't quite as high style. This is a really good one I saw just a couple of years ago. My wife and I were driving around Western Illinois to go to a town, and she wanted to visit for a thing. And while she was doing her thing, I drove around the town and was like, "Oh, I love this courthouse. This actually it's a historic courthouse. The county seat's been moved and it's no longer active. So now it's a museum, but this was built in 1840, did a little research, built in 1840 by John Mandeville as the architect in a little town called Knoxville. And it was the Knox County Courthouse for many years. And this is a pure Greek revival. This, taking the same theme of the Second U.S. Bank or the Tennessee Capitol and applying it to courthouses, which, in Illinois, which was growing in the 1830s and 40s, a way to, it represents that really popular Greek revival style. So again, here we see this is a Doric order with the fluted columns. It's actually quite authentic in that the Doric columns sit right on what we call the stylobate, the base here. They don't have a plinth that they sit on, which is true to the Doric order. And then it has an entablature with triglyphs and metopes, just missing sculptures. So that's pretty authentic as well. And similar to the Tennessee Capitol, it has just a little cupola on top. It's not quite the Lascratus monument reproduction that we saw in Tennessee, but it has the same kind of idea of just a little cupola instead of a big old dome, because domes didn't exist in Greece. That was a Roman invention. And so if you were trying to think of something to cap your building with, the dome would not be the way to go if you're trying to be authentic to the Greek revival. And then here we just have a solid building with, windows, and I like that this is actually a very nice iron stairway there. That's actually pretty cool, mid 20th century ironwork. And this became very popular with houses as well, and starting around 1825 and lasting through around the 1860s. And we actually do see some examples in Illinois throughout, and I'm going to show you a couple of really high style examples and then some more common vernacular examples. So the first one here is the Samuel Russell House. This is in Middleton, Connecticut from 1828. So this is quite early in this sort of range of the popularity of this style. And I think you can see it's the same kind of thing we just saw with the previous examples. It's a Greek temple front. In this case, it's the Corinthian order with a block of house in behind it here. This could be a bank, this could be a state capitol, this could be a county house. It just happens to be a wealthy person's home. So, but it's very authentic. It tries to be quite pure to the actual Greek architecture. And here's another example, this case in South Carolina. This is from 1839, the Milford Plantation. And, you know, this shows you, I'm trying to give you the sense that this was popular all across the country. So New England and South Carolina, two completely culturally different places, to be sure, two different climates. You know, we talked about in colonial architecture that the architecture was driven in many cases by the climate, by the culture, by the materials available. Now that's not anything that's holding people back. You know, the materials are widely available and you can build whatever it is you want. Question, Jaman?
I just noticed that a lot of like plantation houses and like southern homes, they kind of look Greek, like they have the
Yeah,
pillars and those
yeah.
elements.
Yeah, this became really popular with southern plantations, partly because of the wealth in the early 1800s that was being, you know, derived from mostly cotton and other areas, tobacco, and of course, you know, using slave labor to gain that wealth. But the owners there could become quite wealthy, and this was this was the popular style of architecture, and so people, you know, wanted to be, you know, just like today, right? People want to dress the most, you know, in the latest fashion. They want to listen to the latest music and that sort of thing. You know, in this era, you know, you wanted, if you had wealth and you wanted to show that off, you wanted to build in the most popular architectural style of the time. But it also, you know, really sort of probably fit with you know, the culture of that area is the sort of this grand estate, and you know, living high on the hog, I guess. And we see the same kind of thing we saw in the Connecticut example. It's the Corinthian order, very properly proportioned with the entablature. This is a little different in that this has just sort of a parapet on the top, because we're in the south. We don't have to worry about snow loads. So the roof pitch does not have to be as steep, and so we can see a shallower roof. We don't even see really the roof itself. Whereas if we look back, you know, at the Connecticut example where they have to deal with snow on a regular basis, they have a more traditionally pitched roof here. So we see that difference, and I think we see that same thing in my next example. The Lanier Mansion in Madison, Indiana from 1846. And Madison sits right on that boundary between North and South. It's technically in Indiana, which was a northern free state, and this was not a plantation. This was just a wealthy person's home in a pretty wealthy river town. But just across the border was Kentucky, which was, you know, the culturally and economically the South. So we see almost the same kind of architecture that we saw with the Milford Plantation, in that they don't have to worry about snow too much, and so it has a flatter roof. So we see that same entablature. We see the columns, which are a little more of a derivative of Corinthian. They're not quite as pure. And one of the things that really drives this architectural style is what we call style books. You know, architects and designers and publishers would start to publish some of these house plans and elevations, and builders who didn't have any traditional architectural training, they could just sort of build, you know, instead of having to draw up a blueprint, they could just look at these house plans, you know, published in a book that they could buy, and the owner could say, hey, I really like that one. And they'll say, okay, I could build that for you, and I'll just copy what's in here. So often these weren't really designed by architects per se. They were just built by builders who were using these plan books as a way to guide, you know, for them. And especially true when we look at the more vernacular examples. This one here, the Warner House, is in Michigan. This dates from 1855, so this is a little bit late in the range of the style period. And this is what we call an upright and wing type house. It's generally a pretty vernacular farmhouse that was very common in this era in places like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, even in large parts of Illinois, that were were growing rapidly in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. And it was a cheap house, quick cheap house to build. You typically built this 2-story or 1.5-story wing or upright, and then a 1-story wing off the side. The wing usually housed like the kitchen and so forth, and the upright was the more formal living room, parlor, and upstairs would have been the bedrooms. Often it was only a story and a half, and you can see that instead of having a full triangular pediment, they break it. It's called a broken pediment, and you just have the returns to give you the sense that it was a triangular pediment. But because you needed the taller windows here, they don't carry that bottom line all the way across. But notice it does have the corner pilasters, and even on the little recessed portico of the wing here, it has the pilasters, and the 2 pilasters become full columns, create kind of a little loggia. By no means, are you going to be fooled and you think, my God, that looks exactly like a Greek temple? But this represents how popular the style was, that if you were a farmer, you were building your house out on the prairie, didn't have a lot of resources, and you might have even been building this yourself, or you had a guy locally that knew how to build, carpenter. They could just copy some of the details of the pilasters and the entablature over the doorway, and you sort of had the popular style. You couldn't afford the grand mansion like this, right? But you could at least have something that was reflective of that popular Greek revival that was really common. Here's another example. This is in Vermilion, Ohio, probably from the 1850s. This is a little lakeside town that my family has a cottage, so we visit every summer at least. And walking around the town, I came across this a few years ago. I'm like, I'm gonna throw this in my slideshow on Greek Revival. And we see this a little more clearly. We've got the broken pediment on the upright. We've got the pilasters, and we have a nice entablature over the doorway. Nothing purely Greek here, really. I mean, the pilasters are not Ionic or Corinthian. They're almost just sort of stylized, but they're conveying the idea of a classical order in a cheaper way that a carpenter locally could have built. Okay, so that kind of carries the Greek revival, and that ends, again by around 1860. It certainly ends with the American Civil War. We don't really see it built or used after that. The Civil War certainly ended this sort of romantic idea of American democracy, tying it to Greeks and Romans, and that emerge out of that with a completely different culture and a completely different kind of architecture. One of which is going to be this one that we're talking about here, the 19th century Gothic Revival. And this also, like the Greek Revival, it had its origins in England, especially with this gentleman, Augustus Welby Northmore Pugin. You can just call him Pugin on the quiz if you're asked about him. So Pugin was actually son of a French emigre that had fled the violence of the French Revolution, settled in England, and he grows up, basically in England. And this is beginning of one of the counters to the Industrial Revolution that we talked about a couple lectures ago, right? That had its origins really in the 18th century, but really exploded in the 1800s, especially in England. And while it became quite popular, especially for structure and buildings and bridges, there was still a resistance to it as an architectural expression. And in fact, there was a cultural reaction to the Industrial Revolution that people began to think that maybe they were losing something, some tie to a better past. And almost all of these people romanticized the past. And we'll talk more about this in a couple more lectures after the midterm break. But there tended to be a romanticization of the past. In a similar way, right, of thinking about those southern plantations, the grand, colonnaded things of Terra, right? Gone with the Wind, a very romanticized view of, southern plantation life for the great majority of people that live there. And the same thing, great majority of people who lived in a medieval era had a pretty shitty life. They had a subsistence living, and often faced starvation, disease, plagues, and there was a 1% that had power and wealth, and everybody else didn't. But when you're living through such a cultural shift, there tended to be sort of this idea that maybe people had a better life back then than the drudgery of going and working in a factory for barely subsistence wages, living in tenement housing with disease all around you, and one little mistake on the factory floor, and you lose a finger or an arm or something, and your life is in turmoil. So there, that's part of what came to, and we'll talk more about it. But Pugin was definitely a part of this, and he put together these books that kind of compared the 19th century industrial revolution with this romanticized medieval era. So on the top image you see what was becoming pretty common in English cities, big brick factory buildings with smokestacks spewing, soot and coal soot and all that. And he compares that to a medieval city or village with a nice stone bridge and church spires, ringing bells, let you know that it's time to go to church, and quaint little medieval stone and half-timbered cottages that people might have lived in. Again, the reality of that is far-fetched, but it had a strong appeal, and so this Gothic Revival architecture really comes out of that. This idea that, gee, if we make our buildings look like a better time or a simpler time, that was kind of an appeal. Here's another example of, on the top, sort of the modern way of poor people living, almost looks like a prison, really, right? And then the way that people might have lived in medieval times, in a monastery with an open cloister and all that. And scenes of life today, and life for them today, and life then. So this really helped to spur this romanticized Gothic revival. And Pugin was involved in one of the most significant works of Gothic revival, the Parliament House in London, also known as Westminster Palace. Construction started on this in 1836 and was largely completed by 1868. Charles Barry was also more the official architect. Pugin was more of like the designer and more of the inspiration. This occurred after a fire had destroyed the old medieval era Westminster Palace, which had become the seat of Parliament for the English government. And so this fire destroys that, and what do you rebuild it with? And Pugin strongly pushed, and Parliament agreed, that it should be rebuilt in this Gothic medieval style. So here we see a plan of it. On the top is the Thames, would be where the Thames River is. There's a large courtyard. Item 13 is Westminster Hall. This is a remnant that survived the fire and survives, its original actual Gothic medieval architecture. And then, let's see, I think 7 is the House of Lords and 15 is the House of Commons. This is, if you ever see English C-SPAN version or something like that, you would see images from those. And then over here on the far left is 14. That's the Elizabeth Tower that is sometimes mistakenly called Big Ben. So here is a view of it as it was finished, this view today. So it sits dramatically along the Thames River. Here is Elizabeth Tower. Big Ben is actually the clock face itself. It's not the entire tower. You can see some of the original Gothic architecture over here on the far right. That's the original, and then this is, you know, inspiring the Gothic revival of the Parliament houses itself. Interesting about this is that it's Gothic in style, but it was built in a modern 19th century manner. It actually has a lot of cast iron in it because that was the quick, easy, functional way to build. So rather than being built of solid stone masonry with flying buttresses and all of that, this is largely framed with cast iron, you know, structural construction, and then clad with stone to make it look like it was, you know, a load-bearing structure. So we don't actually see flying buttresses on this building because they didn't need them because the structure itself was more self-supporting. Here's a view along the Thames with the tower on the right, and here's, you know, this long facade. This is not, you know, a medieval construction that could have been built with stonework, you know, in the 12th century or something like that, just because it was too big, it was too massive, without, you know, significant buttressing and all that we talked about last fall. So the irony of, you know, of something like this, of this, you know, revival, a Gothic revival of, you know, bringing back a more romanticized, you know, architecture of the past, is that they're using modern technologies and construction to actually do it and to build bigger buildings that would be appropriate in this era. Here's the view of the Elizabeth Tower with the clock face Big Ben. You'll sometimes find that in trivia questions that it's Big Ben is just the clock. You know, so keep that stored in your mind later, or you could put that on your little significant statement if you put Parliament in your flashcards. Here's a view of one of the halls here, again, made to look like a Gothic, you know, almost like a Gothic church. It has, you know, bundled piers, it has fan vaulting up in the top, pointed arches, you know, it has a very authentic look of Gothic architecture. It just happens to be built with modern cast iron all around it, so that most of what we see is just a cladding to make it look like, you know, the original stone construction. This is the House of Lords. Same thing. We see lots of decorative carved woodwork. We see all this stained glass like you might expect to see in a Gothic cathedral, and pointed arched windows and all that. But it can be built this way because of modern cast iron. Here's the House of Commons. Again, similar big open grand space in which the roof structure can cast iron, and so there, you know, the wood cladding and stuff is, you know, often more decorative than it is structural. Another space, the Royal Gallery. I think when the Queen visits Parliament, she would host a reception in the gallery here, perhaps. I like to show these just because this Claude Monet, who also ironically was a modernist painter, right? You know, the Impressionism of the late 19th century was the radical, you know, modernists of the time and era, but yet he painted, at least in this case, scenes of this romanticized, you know, revival of medieval architecture. So I love the irony in that as well. All right, and we see it become very popular in the United States as well, starting in the 1830s. Obviously, the construction of Parliament would have been a big news, you know, in America, and certainly amongst American architects and designers. They would have seen, you know, images of that, and were, you know, had similar ideas. Many architects and designers and people had similar thoughts about, you know, the Industrial Revolution and the cultural changes that were occurring in the United States as well, especially in places like New York City. or that were more heavily industrialized. So one of the primary examples, and a very early one in the U.S., is Trinity Church in New York, built from 1839 to 46 by Richard Upjohn. So Upjohn, that we see here, he was English born, interestingly, and immigrated to the US and had a very successful career as an architect in the United States, and helped to popularize the Gothic Revival with what we see here, one of these plan books that I was talking about. In this case, it's focusing on Gothic architecture, but the same kinds of things were being used or developed for Greek Revival architecture earlier on. And of course, printing and publishing had become much easier. It was, books were becoming much more accessible to the average person. And so if you were a builder or a designer, you could buy Upjohn's book here, and it was filled with images like we see on the bottom here, this little Carpenter Gothic church. And I'll show you an example of what I'm talking about a little later. And you could, if you had a client, you could show your client, let them flip through the book, and they might say, I really love that. That's perfect. That's what I think of when I think of a church. And so he could, you're, as a builder, you could say, okay, I could build that for you. And there's usually a plan in there, and you could, essentially reproduce this. And of course, Gothic Revival became very popular with churches because people had this association of the old European churches, with those Gothic cathedrals. So here is Trinity Church, and it's still there. This is a historic view from the early 20th century, and you can see it's already being surrounded in the early 20th century by, at that time, skyscrapers, early skyscrapers. It's even more dwarfed now by modern, Manhattan. But when it was built, this was one of the most prominent landmarks in Manhattan. The church spire towered over just about everything else. Most buildings were only 2, 3, 4 stories tall. A tall building might have been 5 stories at the time, and so this church spire would have really dominated the skyline of Manhattan at that time. But you can see it looks like a Gothic cathedral or church similar to what we talked about in the fall semester. Pointed arches, buttresses. This doesn't have flying buttresses because, again, they don't need to build those if you can build a frame out of cast iron here. But you can get the tall nave with the clear story windows. You've got the side aisles, all the kinds of things we talked about with Gothic architecture previously. So here's a nice rendering of probably how it looked originally. With an open landscape around it. There's the Hudson River off in the background, and it would have been a much more quaint looking kind of church at that time. And this is my photo when I was there in New York a couple of years ago. Wall Street is literally, I think this is a block away. So I'm standing at Wall Street, and I'm looking down this canyon of buildings at the church, and you can see even now it's dwarfed by these early 20th century buildings. But here's an interior view of it, and it's a very authentic, recreation of a Gothic church with the fan vaulting, the ribbed columns, pointed arches, the side aisles, clear story windows, really beautiful stained glass window behind the altar work. Upjohn was a very talented designer architect, and so he could do a very excellent job of reproducing the European, Northern European Gothic architecture in New York City. We're going to talk about Trinity Church actually just a little bit, Bea, so hold that quick and you'll understand the difference in a moment. So here's another example. This is also by Upjohn from 1853, but this is in rural Wisconsin, Delafield, Wisconsin, St. Chrysostom Church. And this is what we call a Gothic Carpenter or Carpenter Gothic church. So in that book, that page that I was showing you, he was showing you how you could do Gothic architecture in wood, because again, in rural Wisconsin, they got a lot of trees, and it's a small church, small town. They're not going to build with stone and cast iron and all of that. They don't need that much big of a church, and they don't have the resources for that. So Carpenter Gothic became very popular for just small wood frame churches. And translating stone into wood can be a little tricky, but some of the elements of traditional Gothic architecture are there. Now we do see a couple small windows with pointed arches. That's very distinct translation there. But over the entranceway, they used a triangular uh, element to create the essence of a pointed arch gateway or doorway, and they put some stained glass in that, but we wouldn't see this sort of sharp geometric triangle in traditional Gothic architecture. Same thing with the front facade and the two side aisles here. Traditionally, that would have been a pointed arched and all that. Don't need to do that in wood, and the arch isn't necessary in wood. So they just used regular steep pitches, and often would put what's known as verge board or barge board in here, which had some cutout decorations, similar to what you would have seen carved wood interiors in medieval architecture. But you get the sense of, a central tall nave and two shorter side aisles. But again, very, just like we saw with the Greek Revival upright and wing farmhouse, translating that into something more vernacular changes it pretty radically. Here's the interior, and we see a little more distinctive. Here's some more, pointed arches that you would expect to see in a Gothic church. But again, it's not a fan vault. It's not stone pointed vaulting. It's just framed up on as a triangle that you would do out of wood. They put a little bit. I like this sort of buttress or pier over on the far right side here. It's got a little bit of the curvature that you might expect to see in a vault, that kind of also helps to sort of visually translate that. But the ceiling itself is tall. It's not a flat ceiling as you would not expect to see in a Gothic church, and so they leave it open, but it's just not vaulted the same way that you would do if you were using stonework. So another great example by another very talented early American architect is St. Patrick's Cathedral. This is also in New York City from a couple decades later. So Trinity was kind of the beginning element of Gothic revival in America and in New York. And so just a couple decades later, it's still very popular. And the major cathedral, St. Patrick's, designed by James Renwick, is designed even grander and even taller, even still, though, dwarfed by the skyscrapers of modern Manhattan, as you see in the background there. But here we see a really fine detail of Gothic revival. Really high-end Gothic, the very tall pointed spires, the rose window over the main entry here. Some ideas, kind of not quite make them out, but you can almost see the ideas of flying buttresses and all of that. But again, this has got a cast iron frame. This isn't necessarily built purely of stone vaulting the way the Gothic builders would have done. Here's a nice historic view of it where it's towering over everything else around it instead of vice versa there. But you get a nice view of the clear story off to the side, some of the piers and buttresses. Again, they don't have to quite go all the way into flying buttresses because they're just not necessary, and they would have been, expensive and complicated to build. But he's at least introducing the piers to give you the sense of the flying buttresses. Here's a nice facade view of it. It was cleaned in 2015 to get all the soot and grime off of it, so you see the bright white stone really nicely in this image. Here you can really easily see the rose window with the stone tracery and the really pointed entrances, pointed arch entrances. And a nice interior view from the balcony, so you get a really good detailed view of the vaulted ceiling with the fan vaulting and the bundled columns that were traditional in Gothic architecture. But again, probably framed up in cast iron, and the stone is really more, it's a decorative ceiling, really. It's not what's supporting the roof structure itself. There's another roof on top of this that is framed up differently, and so you don't need a construction techniques that the builders would have used in medieval era. Here's a nice up view of the fan vaulting. Really nicely done. I mean, you walk in this and you think you're in a Gothic cathedral right out of France or Germany or even England. Here's a nice stained glass window. Of course, if any good Gothic Revival church has got to have some stained glass. This one's kind of fun because this right here, sort of in the center left, is James Renwick, the architect, and he's presenting the plans to the bishop and the cardinal, and he gets immortalized on one of the stained glass windows in his own church. So if you're an architect, and he even gets his name on here and everything. So if you're an architect, that's pretty cool that you get your image and your name permanently inscribed in the building you designed there. All right, so let's flip back across the pond, as they say, and let's talk about Volley Leduc. Volley Leduc was a French architect and really helped to popularize the Gothic Revival and this romanticized medieval revival as a counterpoint to the Industrial Revolution. And he's often considered to be one of the first preservationists, in fact, in the modern world, because he restored many of the French Gothic medieval buildings, including Notre Dame in Paris and many other churches like Saint Denis and others that had largely fallen into disrepair after the French Revolution. The French Revolution, the uprising, not only took out the king and the monarchy, but they also revolted against the Catholic Church, who they had seen as a partner with the monarchy oppressing the common man. And so there was a very strong reaction against the Catholic Church and against the property they owned and the taxes that people had to pay to the church and all of that. And so the churches in many cases were defaced, vandalized, and damaged directly, and in other cases, Catholicism felt so out of favor that there just wasn't the upkeep anymore. People weren't, putting their money in the basket at communion time, so they were falling into great amount of disrepair by the mid 19th century. And Volley Leduc is one of those who, because he had this romanticized view of glorifying the medieval era, helped to oversee the restoration of many of these buildings. So here's a list, many of them that he restored or repaired, including Saint Denis that we talked about, Sainte-Chapelle, Notre Dame, and a number of others throughout France and that region. In many cases, he would kind of got fanciful in his restorations. They became more just fantasy recreations on his part, some more than others. I'll give you a couple of examples in a moment. But he wrote prolifically. One of his books was this here, Dictionary of French Architecture from the 11th to 16th century, that helped to popularize, this medieval architecture, as well as a number of other books that, helped revive this as a Gothic revival and new architecture, but also the restoration of monuments. But, Volley Leduc also was a product of his time. And like we saw, say, at Parliament, where, it was a Gothic, neo-Gothic construction with, modern cast iron technologies, Leduc also was not shy about incorporating modern cast iron structures and technologies into his buildings, but not wanting his, didn't think that architecture ought to look like, industrial architecture. That might be fine for bridges or for a factory building or a warehouse, but it was certainly not appropriate for public buildings. Anything, and we saw that. We talked about that when I talked about 19th century industrial architecture. That um, the train station, King's Cross train station, was reviled by the general public because it looked too much like a factory building, like a train station. It didn't look like a fanciful neoclassical creation that was more popular at the time. All right, so one of his most prominent projects to work on was Notre Dame in Paris, which we talked about in the fall semester quite a bit. And he worked on this between 1845 and 1864. It had really fallen into disrepair by this time. It had been significantly vandalized. Many of the sculptures and statuary that was on it had been ripped off and torn down. So it needed a lot of work, and it was really through Volley Leduc's efforts and the French government, which by this time had kind of restored the monarchy essentially, them paying for it helped to save this building. We might not have Notre Dame if it had not been for Leduc. But one of the things the cathedral is so famous for are the gargoyles and technically the grotesques. A gargoyle is the water spout we see right here. Grotesque, a sculptural ornament that sits on top of something. And these are all fanciful recreations by Volley Leduc, based on his own imagination. These probably would have been different sculptural elements on here for at least certainly for the gargoyles, but they had cracked and fallen off over time, and so most of them were missing. And he added, in many cases, he simply added the grotesques sitting on top here. And these are what a lot of people think about now when they think of Notre Dame. You take a tour, you can walk up the tower and see these things pretty close up, and people think, wow, this is great medieval architecture, except it dates from the mid 19th century. And it wasn't truly authentic in its creation. The other thing that he did that there's no record of, there might have been a spire on it at some point, but here at the crossing, he put this spire on. And this is, again, ironically, was built out of iron and lead and all that modern materials to create a revival Gothic spire that probably didn't even exist at all in the original medieval era of Notre Dame. But it became, as you see in this image, it became an icon, element or image of the cathedral from this great vantage along the Seine River. And so when it burned in 2019, and people watched as this spire engulfed in flames crumbled under the heat because iron melts, as we would learn in many fires, including the Chicago fire. It just it saddened people. It shocked them, and they were horrified by this, even though this was not medieval. It was not original to the cathedral at all. And there was a huge controversy actually. And the French president Macron said, "Hey, I think we should have a design competition to rebuild the spire, and we could maybe have some kind of really contemporary spire." And people reacted with horror that this wonderful Gothic spire wasn't going to be recreated, even though it was recreated by Volley Leduc in the 1850s. So. All right, so in houses, it also became popular, not as popular as the Greek Revival, but it certainly, for at least wealthier, more middle class and wealthier homeowners, it was common to see the Gothic Revival. The first example I'll show you is King's Court in Newport, Rhode Island from 1839, also by Richard Upjohn, so we've talked about him. He became he was a very well-known architect, and so he got a lot of prestigious commissions, and Newport became a wealthy enclave. A lot of New Yorkers and Bostonians who could afford to built homes in Newport, Rhode Island, which was a seaside community, and it was a summer getaway. Get out of the dirty, hot, dank city that smelled bad and all that, and enjoy a much more pleasant summer along the coast in Rhode Island. People still do that today. They get out of Chicago, they go to the shores of Michigan, over in southwest Michigan, right? So we saw a boom of wealthy mansions being built in Newport, starting in the 1830s, all the way into the end and even early 20th century. And Kingscote is an early example of this, and in the Gothic Revival style, but kind of more the Carpenter Gothic. Again, translating a Gothic church into something that's a private home is not an easy thing to do, but he has the elements here. We have this tall pitched roof with this barge board that kind of gives the idea of a pointed arch. There's a little bit of pointed arch, leaded glass windows in here, but we just see a lot of tall pointed dormer windows. We see these little entablatures over the windows and on this bay window here. These are not classical in any ways. These are more typically found in medieval architecture. And the doorway even is, right here in the center, is a pointed arched doorway with lots of wood paneling. On the interior, we see a lot of woodwork. Again, similar to what would have been built in many interiors in the medieval era. This even has pointed arches built into the doorways here, so that is a more direct connection to that Gothic revival. Same thing in the parlors that we see here, pointed arched openings, lots of rich woodwork with carvings. Often you see these elaborate mantles. This one's out of wood, but often they'd be built out of stone. Fireplace mantles, often oversized, like you could walk into the fireplace almost, which was common in medieval era. Giovanni, you have a question?
Yeah, is this the same thing as like Queen Anne style or like Victorian?
No, it's not actually. So Queen Anne is a little later style that I'm not going to really talk about it too much. We just don't have time for it. It derives partly out of the Gothic Revival, and it has a medieval, kind of a neo-medieval character to it. But this is still more purely Gothic Revival. So like I say, I don't really have time to kind of get into a lot of the detail of the Queen Anne, but that becomes really popular in the late 19th century after the Civil War, also by very wealthy people.
Thank you.
Yeah. So here's a great example in brick. This is, I don't even know where this is, but it just gives you a great example. If you use masonry, you can do brick or stone. If you're, it's a little more expensive to build in a brick house, but you can have the pointed arches. Here we're still seeing the tall pitched roof with a little bit of barge board thrown in for the decoration. We see almost kind of a little bit of neo-Gothic installed on the porch. This example because the porch is still really intact. Porches often get rebuilt over time because they're out there in the elements and they decay easily. And even these little window hoods are somewhat more Gothic in their inspiration, or medieval in their inspiration. Certainly nothing neoclassical, nothing Greek or Roman on this house at all. And this is, same kind of house, but in Carpenter Gothic. So the same kind of principles apply to that little church in Wisconsin we talked about. Here we see, but in a private house, again, slightly pointed arched porch here. The really tall pitched roof with the barge board thrown in as decoration, leaded glass windows, which were common in medieval construction. You don't need stained glass in a house. You want to be able to look out the window. So typically, you would just see the leaded glass that was common in medieval construction. And with this sort of little drop down entablature that goes over the top of that. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is the Richardsonian Romanesque. So Gothic Revival starts in the sort of 1830s and becomes really popular in the 1840s, 50s, even into the 1860s. But in the starting in the mid 19th and very popular in the 1870s and 80s is a Romanesque revival essentially, and it often is known as Richardsonian Romanesque because of this gentleman who really popularized in the United States, H. Richardson, Henry Hobson, usually shortened to H. Richardson. He was from Louisiana, but he studied at Harvard in Boston, so he was a trained architect. He actually went to and studied in Paris at the École des Beaux-Arts, and was one of the first earliest architects in America to have studied at the École, which was the most prestigious architecture school in the world at that time, the École des Beaux-Arts. And we'll talk more about that in a later lecture. But he comes back to the US, settles in Boston, and becomes extremely prolific and popular, so popular that he gets a style named after him. It's basically a Romanesque revival of style, but because it was so associated with Richardson, people began to just call it the Richardsonian Romanesque. But it's same principles that we talk about with the Gothic. It's going backward time, right? Because the Romanesque period was an earlier development before the Gothic in real time, but in the revival era, the Gothic revival comes first, and then the Romanesque actually comes after that. And his most famous work, and this will answer your question, Bea, is Trinity Church in Boston from 1877. And this really put him on the map nationally and got him a lot of commissions all across the country. So this is the front facade of it. And what we see here, again, is a really high style, very detailed, accurate representation of the Romanesque architecture. And if you kind of remember from the fall semester, or if you didn't take the class in the fall, what was distinctive about Romanesque architecture is it used round Roman arches and vaults instead of the pointed Gothic arches and vaults. That's the biggest, easiest way of distinguishing. Gothic architecture tended to have a lot more light, a lot larger windows. They became more sophisticated with their structure, and so the amount of heavy masonry stonework was reduced, and they could build bigger windows to let in more light. Romanesque tended to have not just the rounded arches, but tended to have heavier stonework, and you can see that I think pretty well in this building. There's windows here, but not a lot of them, right? They're small, they're slender. You see a lot of heavy masonry here, and of course the rounded arched windows throughout. The towers are not tall and spindly, because in Romanesque architecture they didn't have the ability or sophistication to build the really, really tall pointed spires. And so here on the two corners, they're quite short and stocky, and even the main tower here is rather stocky and heavy looking. Here's a historic view of it. So unlike tall, spiring verticality of Trinity Church, or Trinity Cathedral and St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York that we just showed you, this is heavy, this is bulky, it's stocky, kind of like Richardson was himself. You saw the photo, he was let's go back to the photo because I want to point something else out. He was a rather stocky man, to say the least. And notice he's dressed in, I didn't point this out, he's dressed in like a monk's robes, right? He looks like he just walked out of a medieval monastery. And that's how he dressed. Now, if you're a really large man in this era, that's an easy way to dress, I guess. But this was kind of a character, right, that he developed. He became so known for this style of architecture that he dressed like this, like a medieval monk, to kind of fit the part almost. All right, so let's flip back to Trinity Church again. So here, and again, we see in this historic view, here's the front facade kind of towards the right. There you see the portico, or the narthex for the church, and you can see better the tower. It's a tall tower. It's prominent, but it's still not the sort of tall soaring towers that we would have expected to see in Gothic architecture. So it's more reflective of this Romanesque architecture. So here's a floor plan, and even the floor plan is more Romanesque and medieval. It doesn't have the long nave with the long side aisles and the deep transept. It has a short nave, it has a really wide transept and a rounded apse at the very back. Off to the side are the sort of rectory buildings for, the chancel building where the, staff lived, the priest or minister, whoever would have lived there in the side building here. And there's even a little bit of a cloister. If you look right here, is a little bit of an open courtyard, which would have been similar to a medieval cloister. And a great view of the interior, really richly decorated and ornamented, more so in many ways than even a typical Romanesque church would have been. But again, we see more rounded arch, rounded vaulting, more typical of Roman era, which is what the Romanesque was using at that era, rather than the tall pointed vaulting and arches. And just very, very heavily decorated. It's a beautiful space inside. Here's another nice view of it. Bea, you had asked the question, have you seen Trinity Church in Boston? Is that why you were asking the question? Still there? All right, well, anyway, we'll move on. So here's a nice detail of some of the stained glass. But again, notice how oh, okay. Thanks, Bay. You had to research it. Yeah, so it's a really impressive church. So here, pointing out the windows, notice they're tall and slender. These are not the big, massive windows that we would expect to see in Gothic architecture, and that's one of the differences between Romanesque and the later Gothic. And Richardson is authentic to that. He doesn't, change that, at least here. And John Lafarge is a very, very famous stained glass maker from this era. So there's a great, very important building by Richardson in Chicago. And we're going to start talking about Chicago right here, right now. Just going to give you a little taste of it. And pretty soon we'll be diving into full-fledged, Chicago school and all of that. A lot of the second half of the semester is going to focus on Chicago. But we'll get our first taste. And Richardson was instrumental in helping to inspire some of the later architecture and architects of the Chicago school. So Glessner House was built in 1887. It was on Prairie Avenue on the south side. At that time, Prairie Avenue in the near south side, we call it the South Loop nowadays, that was the most prestigious neighborhood of Chicago. And so if you had wealth and power, if you were an industrialist or whatever, you had a mansion typically along Prairie Avenue or very close to it. So Potter Palmer, Marshall Field, the McCormicks, the McCormick Reaper and all that, all those industrialists, right? Early Chicago industrialists had their mansions along here. Almost all of them were destroyed in the 20th century as, ironically, the industry that in many cases they were building grew and sort of supplanted that. And the wealthy then shifted to the north side, and now we have the Gold Coast, right, in the near north, where the wealthy houses are, and most of those survived that didn't get torn down for high rises. But this house survived. This is a current view of what it looks like, and we can see, first of all, that it is a Romanesque structure. It has heavy rusticated stone masonry. It looks a bit like a castle. If this is almost taking the truism to the statement, right? Your home is a castle, right? Your home is your castle. This is almost a literal interpretation of that. And in many ways, the neighbors didn't like this when it got built. They had their more traditional revival styles and like Giovanni brought up the Queen Anne that we're not really talking about. This to them looked like a prison or a fortress, and not the way they thought a home should look like. But a lot of architects were looking at this and thinking, wow, that's pretty cool. But the most distinctive element that makes this Romanesque is this archway, right? That the front door. This is the front door, very nondescript front door, which is rather striking. And it's mostly emphasized by this arched stone relief above that. And then you got some fantastic, windows along here. This is a little doorway for the carriages off into the courtyard. Oops. Trying to click next. Here we go. Here's a nice historic view. There you can see they're actually just finishing up the construction of it, in fact. And, really distinctive, seeing that distinctive archway over the doorway. Here you can see a little better the carved pillars of these windows at the second floor. And you can see how long it is. It goes all the way down the corner here. And I want to show you the archway that you see way almost to the far right down there. Detail of that in a moment. Here's the floor plan. So the front of the house is over here on the left. That's the front facade. And then we were seeing the side street view in that last image. And we don't see the front door here just because it's on a different level or whatever to what the floor plan is. But basically the front entrance is right here, leads into kind of a entryway and a stairway up to what the French called the premier étage, or the first floor, which was typically raised up off the ground. If we go back to the image, you can see that the main level is here, and you see it's raised up off the ground, even though the doorway is at the street level. So here is, you can see it's a courtyard house. So he's really keeping the sense of a cloister, of a medieval monastic cloister in this house, and that provides a lot of privacy for the Glessners, the homeowners here. And you can tell in the plan that there's actually quite a few windows along here. So you could have a lot of windows, a lot of light coming in, but you don't lose your privacy because you have this inner courtyard that's in along here. And if you're rich and famous and wealthy and you don't want people peering in and looking at all the stuff that you might be afraid they'd come back and steal later, if you're a little paranoid, then this was a perfect kind of house for you, because it really closed itself off from the street face. But it has a beautiful bay window. This is the dining room center with a fantastic bay window looking out onto the cloister. The stables are over here on the far right, and the carriage porte cochere is up here in the upper left. So the Glessners would have been, they would have had a driver for their carriage, and they would have come in here, and there was a little doorway they could step out under the covering, and they didn't have to get wet if it was raining or in the snow, and then the driver could carry on down the drive and into the stables and here in the back. So here is an aerial view of it, and you can make out the cloister or the courtyard on the inside. Originally, there would have been a house on the site next to it. Like I say, almost all of these were torn down. They're rebuilding. There's some parks there. There's a couple of houses that are left, and there's a lot of new housing development that's pretty high end, not quite as high end as it used to be, but still a pretty nice neighborhood again. So this is the doorway along the side. This was the side entry, actually. So the staff would have come here. If you were a delivery man, you brought your milk every morning, or the fresh meat from the butcher or something like that. This is the side entry that you would have used, not the main front door, of course. But it's distinctive. It's Romanesque. It has this Roman barrel vaulted arch, right? But it is really distinctive to Richardson in that it's really prominent, and there's even like a little knee wall that takes up part of the archway, so that the actual opening here is only half of the archway. This is not something that would have been done in traditional, Romanesque medieval era or architecture. This is distinctive to H.H. Richardson, and it was very inspiring to architects from Chicago that came after him, like Sullivan and Wright. They would often use that archway like that. we'll see examples of that later when we talk about them. Here's a few interior views. Similar to kind of the interior views of the Gothic Revival, we saw lots of woodwork, heavy, stained wood, often very rich quality wood. They were tearing down a heck of a lot of trees, mahogany and trees and stuff like that in Central and South America that no longer really are there. There's not many of those left. So when they say they don't build them like they used to, that's because the wonderful woods that they used are almost totally gone now. But it's just gorgeous. This is a house you can take a tour. Anyone, click your little hands up or whatever if you've ever taken a tour of the Glessner House. It's a wonderful tour. If you haven't, and I'm not seeing anyone clicking on here, it's well worth a visit. I don't think the tickets are all that much. So when things are back to normal, take the time to go down to Prairie Avenue and take a tour of the house. This is the dining room I showed you in the floor plan. It has that beautiful bay window that looks out into the courtyard or cloister. It's partly covered by these heavy drapes. That was really common in the late 19th century, but it really would have let a lot of light in here and a great view for the family, but private. They would have really appreciated the privacy that offered. This is one of the drawing rooms. This would have been the man's parlor, where he could sit, after dinner with a cigar and a brandy and, chat with the boys, about, work and, whatever. I forget what the Glessners did, but I think he was some kind of industrialist. So another Chicago project by Richardson, actually, is the Marshall Field Warehouse Store. This dates from 1885, and Marshall Field, you all are maybe a little too young to actually remember the real Marshall Fields, now called Macy's, which still irks a lot of people, a lot of native Chicagoans, that the New York chain Macy's bought them out. It hadn't actually been owned by Marshall Field for many decades, but nevertheless, they were the big department store. They were probably the biggest department store in the country, in the world, in their heyday in the late 19th, early 20th century. And they were the Amazon of the era. You could easily get a Marshall Field's catalog. And, if you could live in some podunk little town in Nebraska or the West Coast or even in, somewhere out east, and, order up at your local merchant, order an item out of the catalog, and it would get shipped to you, partly by rail. That's why Chicago was the rail hub. And within a matter of days, you would, after you sent your check off, you would get your dress or your tool implement or whatever. And Sears was another big mail order catalog, Montgomery Ward, all of them were located in Chicago, including Marshall Fields. And so the point of all that is that you needed Marshall Fields. They had their department store downtown, but they also needed a wholesale store where they stored all this stuff. Like Amazon built that warehouse over by Triton College now. I don't know if you've seen that. Right there at North Avenue and Fifth. That's an Amazon, distribution center. That's, the descendant of something like this, the Marshall Field Warehouse Store. Doesn't look anything like it, right? So here's what it looked like. Also in the Romanesque revival, or the Richardsonian Romanesque, because we have these Roman arches. We see the bigger arches down on the base, and then they get smaller and smaller. The same kind of squared off or rectangular windows at the very top, similar to what we saw at the Glessner House with, carved pillars in between. Very rusticated stone, right? That's another Romanesque feature. They didn't have the sophistication to sort of smooth off the stone and carve it really nice that we would later see in Gothic architecture. They kind of kept the surface really raw. And so we see Richardson doing that here with the warehouse store. And so, this is a great example too of how we started with Trinity Church in Boston. The Romanesque was largely a religious architecture. It, was used in churches and cathedrals and monasteries. we just saw it get adapted to residential use. Now here we're seeing it used to something that is very purely 19th century industrial, architecture, of, a wholesale distribution center. And this would be very inspiring to this gentleman here, Louis Sullivan. I'm going to leave it here because I'll show you in a later lecture when we talk about Sullivan and the Chicago School, I'll show you his early work, including something that almost completely mimicked the Richardson warehouse, Marshall Field warehouse store. And so, because of that, as we'll soon learn, Richardson is kind of seen as like the grandfather of the modern architecture that derived out of Chicago. And it's because of Glessner House, it's because of the Marshall Field warehouse store that we see that partly developed. So that's a different lecture that we're going to jump ahead in a couple of weeks to that. But for now, I'll leave you with Mr. Sullivan here.